The story of Syria's war is brutal, and it begins and ends with the now former president Bashar al-Assad.
It is the story of an uprising against him, brutally suppressed by him. It's been a war which has changed our understanding of brutality. It's shifted politics well beyond its borders, and it has left the country and its people broken and divided.
The war started back in 2011.
The scenes are unprecedented. Day after day of protest, there is talk that Syria is fast reaching the point of no return.
On and off for 13 years, the war was headline news.
Syria has now been at war for 7 years, and if anything, it's getting worse.
After years of laying dormant, the civil war in Syria is suddenly dynamic again, with events shifting almost by the hour.
But as new conflicts have erupted elsewhere, Syria has slowly slipped from the spotlight. Put bluntly, the world's attention has moved on.
A barrage of attacks in Russia's capital today.
At least 25 people have been killed in Ukraine after Russia launched a large-scale attack on the capital, Kiev.
October 7th, 2023. Hamas launches the worst attack Israel has ever faced.
Israel's retaliation has begun.
New strikes across Tehran tonight as the US-Israeli war on Iran is expanding.
Hi, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, we put the spotlight back on Syria. New Zealander Anne Bulley is the Communications Director for Relief Aid, a Kiwi-owned humanitarian organisation working in Syria, as well as Gaza, Ukraine and Afghanistan. For 13 years, she's had to work remotely with the Syrian team. The war made face-to-face contact or meetings impossible. But finally, she's been able to go and meet her team there, and I talked to her last week, hours after she returned home.
The first images of a free Syria. Longtime dictator Bashar al-Assad is toppled. Rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham announces the fall of the regime. Entering Damascus after sweeping across the country in only 10 days.
A fragile shift following the fall of the Assad government 20 months ago gave Anne a window to travel there last week with Relief Aid founder Mike Seawright, fulfilling a promise she made to herself a long time ago. When it was safe enough, she would go. So I start our chat by asking Anne what it was like when she finally landed in the war-torn country.
It's funny because even I'm struggling to even talk about it now. It was incredibly emotional. We landed at Aleppo airport, and Aleppo had obviously been severely impacted during the war. On the plane coming in, I was actually sitting next to a Syrian doctor who had left Syria and was working in America. He was returning home for the first time to actually see his parents, and also his other siblings who were returning from around the world. So talking to him was really interesting about them finally being able to come back to their country and meet. And when we arrived at the airport, there was just a wall of people waiting to meet relatives who were returning for the first time home. There's always, a lot of emotional meetings at airports, but I've never seen anything like it. And people were just hugging and crying and holding on to each other. You sort of felt the emotions of the country straight away. And for me to be able to go there, knowing that this war had finally ended, I think that's what I felt most emotional about. I've been to Ukraine, so I've been into war zones before, but this felt very different because finally this war had finished, and finally you could see there was an opportunity for people to come out the other side and actually to dare to hope again, to dare to think about a future in which, every day wasn't just about survival. So it was a very emotional moment, and a lot of those emotions, to be honest, stayed with me for the entire time I was there.
I bet. And for the past 13 or so years, because of that war, you've had to work remotely with your team there. What was it like when you finally came face to face with them and you actually got to meet them and see their work in person?
Yeah, this was, it was actually great to see them face to face. People that, I'd been worried at times whether they would survive. So to be able to meet them and to see them, women don't hug men in Syria much as I wanted to, but certainly for the women on the team to actually be able to hug them and hold them was really nice. And in terms of seeing the work, as communications director for Relief Aid, my role has been very much about telling the stories of what's been happening in Syria and also how our work has made a difference. To actually be there was like, rather than being in a movie, it was suddenly sort of being on the ground and being part of it. So, for example, we were doing a distribution of food to one of the displacement camps while we were there. So I was able to see the reaction of people as they came to pick up. We were doing big food kits, packs of food, and see the reaction of people, see the children, looking at what have I got, seeing them picking up these huge bags of food and balancing them sometimes on their heads and carrying them back. Towards the end, one of the women came up and she just took my face between her hands and kissed my forehead and thanked me, which was just such an enormously touching moment. Personally to be thanked, but also to be able to sort of receive those thanks on behalf of the people who have supported our work as well. And it was incredibly hot, so it was 40 degrees, and I was invited back into the tents of one of the women and sat there sort of cross-legged next to her and was able to ask her about her life. So being able to talk to a woman similar age to me, and she told me about how she'd been displaced, how they had travelled and done this long journey, what her life had been like since. She had actually been working all through the night before, out in the fields harvesting. So difficult for them to actually, to survive and to be able to sort of sit and listen to that and experience that firsthand was very meaningful.
Gosh, it would be so emotional, amazing experience for you. But also paint us a picture. What does Syria look like now? What is it like on the ground? And was it different from what you were expecting, perhaps?
It's such a good question, because in lots of ways it was as I expected, and in other ways it was quite different. The destruction is huge, building after building, and some of the most beautiful old buildings just destroyed. There's a sort of a chaos on the ground in lots of ways. Places are very busy. Aleppo city is hugely busy. A lot of traffic, a lot of movement, a lot of dust, a lot of dirt, a lot of rubble everywhere. The thing that surprised me was we've been working in displacement camps in Idlib province, so that's where sort of Relief Aid has been working because that's where most of the people were displaced to. Idlib province itself was more developed than, say, Aleppo or Damascus. So on the one hand, it's full of displacement camps still, but on the other hand, in terms of the towns, they had been better developed. So there was more development happening during the war in that area than there was in, say, Damascus or Aleppo, which had suffered much more of the destruction.
Did you at any time feel scared or unsafe while you were there for the 8 days?
Yes, thanks for asking that. So the security system in Syria feels good. I never felt scared at all. But what I would say is there's still strong security presence. So you drive through a lot of checkpoints. You will see armed security personnel on the streets. So you're aware of the security presence, but at no point did I feel unsafe in Syria. And certainly, everywhere people were so welcoming, wanting to help you, wanting to invite you in. We got invited in to met a Syrian lawyer in Aleppo city who just invited us into her house for a cup of tea. That was typical of there. Everywhere you went, people wanted to give you cups of tea and food.
That lawyer she was referring to there is one of the lucky ones to actually live in a house. Many Syrians aren't so fortunate.
The economy is in tatters, with 90% of the country living in poverty. And while it's rebuilding diplomatic ties, people are still waiting for money to rebuild homes and neighbourhoods destroyed by almost 14 years of war.
still a lot of people living in displacement camps, but there's a lot of work in trying to get people out of displacement camps. And the other thing that's happened is that some of those camps are now becoming much more permanent homes for people. So there's actually some rebuilding going on in some of the areas and sites that have been displacement camps. And there you've got new little homes, houses being built, and schools being built, mosques being built, shops being built. So those communities are actually being built around areas that people have been displaced to.
What about the kids, Anne? Because when you were just saying that schools and this is their home, I mean, they've grown up, I guess, knowing little anything other than war and instability. How are they dealing with it? You know, what's the impact on an entire generation?
We work with kids living in displacement camps. So Relief Aid runs an education program for children who have no access to schools. That was one of the things we did while we were there, is to go and see the program operational. And the thing that strikes you is children are hungry. You know, they're hungry for food, and we saw that at our food distribution. But it's not just food they're hungry for. They're hungry for education. They're hungry for an interaction with people. There's an enormous monotony to living in a displacement camp. If you think of it as a child, you don't have anything. You know, you don't have any toys, you don't have any games, you don't have schools to go to. So that interaction, and we'd seen that before, but actually when you're there, you know, they want to talk to you, they want to interact with you, and they're hungry for a future. You really get that sense that sort of children are just, they're wanting more, and they're asking for more. And you're right, you know, an entire generation has missed out on schooling. And this is a country that really values education. And that, you know, repeatedly we saw that and we were told about that. And there is still trauma. For example, we visited Bana, who's one of the ladies who worked with us. I was asking her about her children because, you know, I knew about her children over the time we've been working. She said, if a plane flies over, immediately her children are traumatized. Now, the sound of a plane will fill them with fear.
That's heartbreaking when you think how lucky our kids are here. But do you feel, since the Assad government was overthrown, do you feel now today there is a wee bit of hope, there's a wee bit of resilience, there's a little bit of, you know, we've got a safe future now?
Yeah, I think the resilience and hope are two different things. It's interesting when we talk about people living in war zones. We often talk about the resilience. And I think to a certain extent, if you live in a war zone, you don't have any choice about being resilient. It forces you to be resilient. You have to be resilient to survive. So I'll give you an example of that. I talked to she was 28-year-old Syrian doctor. Raghad was her name, lovely, lovely lady. And she had been at school when the war broke out. And I asked her what had happened the day the war broke out. And she said, we went out on the street and we started protesting. And they were protesting, and then government forces came in and started shooting. And so they disappeared off home very quickly. From going home, her father then said, you've got to stay at home. You can't go back to school. Somebody had written freedom across the walls of the school, and he said it's too unsafe. She had then spent 2 years at home with no school. Then they had set up lessons with the older children, and some of the teachers teaching them in people's houses. So that was then for another couple of years. And then they managed to return back to school, but all the time under fire. They had no power, so no electricity. They were often studying by candlelight. She then went on to Aleppo University and she studied medicine, exactly the same situation. They were being bombed. They had no power. She is now a doctor. At the end of the war, so when the war finished, as the liberation forces, as they would call them, were coming through Aleppo, the Assad forces bombed Aleppo again. She's a paediatrician. They had their kids up on the 8th floor of the hospital. They took the kids and took them down to the ground floor, at the same time frantically wrapping bandages around their torsos and writing their names, their date of birth, their parents' contact numbers, because they were so worried about what happens if these kids get separated or the worst happens. We need to make sure somebody knows who these children are. You know, that to me, that's resilience. But
that's incredible.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether to a certain extent she had any hope, but, you know, tremendous resilience. But I asked her about hope, and she said, in the latter years of the war, and this was something else a lot of people told me, they lost hope. She said, we couldn't see it was ever going to end. It had gone on for so long. We lost hope. But now the war is over, they are daring to hope again. You know, they do hope. And there is a tremendous sense of optimism, but it's a cautious optimism as well. They want to rebuild, and they are rebuilding. There's a huge amount of energy going into rebuilding, but they need help. They can't do it alone.
How much will it cost to rebuild Syria after more than a decade of war? About 184 billion euros.
That's about 360 billion New Zealand dollars.
And that's just to the World Bank's best estimate for rebuilding physical infrastructure.
The world's attention has largely shifted away from Syria. You know, you have Russia and Ukraine, you have, Israeli-Palestine, you have the war in Iran. What has that meant for Syria? And I'm also talking about humanitarian funding and people's attention just drifting away.
Yeah, and we see that. In Relief Aid, we're a little bit of a barometer of that. We work in several war zones in Ukraine, and we're in Gaza, we're in Lebanon. And what we've seen is that we can't get funding for Syria. Certainly funding for Syria has drifted away. The decline of that funding is a huge problem because people are still trapped in camps and there's less support than there has been. So families are actually suffering more to a certain extent. And there's a risk that, if that continues, there's also a risk that will destabilise the country as well, because people have that sense of, we thought it was going to be better, but actually we're worse off. But also Syrians don't want to be dependent on the rest of the world. They want to rebuild, so that they need support. And at the moment they need the immediate support. They need a continuation of humanitarian aid, but they also need support in terms of development. They need development money coming into the country. And that's the other thing. They need sanctions and the banking system lifted, because at the moment it's very hard for people to bring money into Syria. So it's hard for there to be any investment. So the country needs to be opened up so that people can come in and invest. And if they have that, there's enormous hope for the future.
You've obviously seen the situation firsthand and the importance of that. What do you want Kiwis to know about Syria, to understand about Syria and the people living there?
The first thing I would say is they're absolutely beautiful people, the Syrians. They're intelligent, they're engaging, and they are passionate about their country and incredibly welcoming. Everywhere you go, people are saying, welcome to Syria. They're really delighted to see people coming back as well, because obviously they haven't had any visitors for years on end. So the fact that suddenly Western faces are appearing in Syria is a very positive sign for them.
For everyday Kiwis, can they just go there now? Is it safe or fine to just go, right, I'm going to buy a ticket to Syria, here I go, or not yet?
If you ask me, yes. If you look at the government advisories, no. You can buy a ticket and you can go to Syria. I mean, I wouldn't want to be the person advising you to go to Syria against a government advisory, but certainly from my experience, there was no problems flying in there. You need a visa when you arrive in Syria, no problems getting around, and it felt very safe. They're a beautiful building. It's got the oldest city in the world. Aleppo city is the oldest city in the world. The citadel is still standing. A lot of buildings around the citadel not standing. So there's some beautiful things to see in Syria, but you will also see the impact of war firsthand.
After rebel forces seemed to come out of nowhere, taking just days to overwhelm and oust the brutally repressive government that has been in power for several decades. Across the Middle East, Syrians rejoiced as some hope to soon return to their home country.
When the last missile landed, the suffering didn't end. So, to understand that Syria's there, it's got all this potential, but it still needs help. And it needs humanitarian support to start to rebuild. It needs support, as I said, to start to rebuild infrastructures and things like that, agricultural. This is an interesting figure, 4.5 million olive trees were destroyed in Idlib province alone during the war. Olive growing, olive oil was a huge industry for them. So all that needs to be rebuilt. Hospitals need to be rebuilt. Schools need to be rebuilt. So the education centre. But Syria will stand on its own 2 feet. So given the opportunity, given the support now, it wants to stand on its own 2 feet. And one of our team members, that was the last thing he said to me was, I really enjoy working for Relief Aid. I want to continue working for Relief Aid, but I want there to be a time when I no longer need to work for Relief Aid because Syria doesn't need Relief Aid. And I want you to be able to just go and support, or Relief Aid to be able to support people in other countries because we don't need it anymore.
Realistically, how far away is that, do you think, Anne?
We met with local authorities that oversee all the humanitarian aid programs in Idlib province and also in Aleppo city. And they're doing fantastic work. And they have a goal to get everybody out of displacement camps by 2027. I said to them that is a hugely ambitious goal. And I think realistically, that is a hugely ambitious goal. I think if things can open up for Syria, I think 5 years, you would see a very different country.
What can ordinary New Zealanders do if they want to help, Anne?
For ordinary New Zealanders, I think, if you want to see a country that's been at war start to stand on its own 2 feet, continue to support organisations like Relief Aid who are working there. What we can do at the moment is we can just help people get over the hurdle of the initial survival. And the other thing is to advocate for Syria to be opened up more. So in terms of even the, New Zealand government, what can they do to actually help the lifting of sanctions? What can they do to help the banking sector in Syria become opened up so that people can move money into Syria, people can start investing in Syria? It's a good place to invest in because there's a tremendous work ethic there. So it's twofold. Help is still needed. Humanitarian support is still needed for families living in camps, but also it's helping the country rebuild itself. War is terrible. It's so wasteful. It destroys lives. And now, in Syria, there's an opportunity, such a big opportunity to start to rebuild and to give people the future they should have. That they really deserve to have. They've come through this. They need to come out of the other side. A sense of hope coming out of the darkness of the war, despite where we are in the world at the moment.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Anne Bulley. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by William Saunders. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.